Vaporwave is a music genre and art movement that has a reputation of being not so easily explainable, and if you saw the timestamp on this video, I'm sure that you can see that. But despite its foggy and sometimes even self-contradictory nature, I'm gonna attempt to make this video as simple and interesting as I can. And I think I'll start here. Anemoia is the feeling of baseless nostalgia, a sense of longing for a past you didn't have, an era you never lived in, or perhaps even one that didn't happen. This obscure feeling is what had initially drawn me to Vaporwave almost a decade ago now, when I, like many other future Vaporwave fans, had heard Vektroid's legendary 2011 album Floral Shop for the first time. This lilting and distorted track is Lisa Frank 420 Modern Computing, and it quickly became an immortal classic, a new form of retro that the people of the internet had never seen or heard before. It brought Vaporwave not only to life, but into so many people's lives. It was strange. This song traveled through memes, a musical medium that, just like Vaporwave, has never truly been taken that seriously by the masses. We'll talk more about Floral Shop and its impact later, but for now let's talk about the surprising iceberg of ideas that Vaporwave truly is. Despite its humble beginnings and introduction to the world via memetics, you might be surprised to hear just how much is going on under the surface here. Vaporwave music is forever locked in an internal conflict, split between two worlds. A track could feel decidedly alive, like the synths and cloudy vocals are breathing, and the drums are nothing but a digital heartbeat keeping it on track. It has this very real and alive, tangible quality to it, but to contrast this, it also clearly feels dead. It has this empty, static, liminal feeling that's inescapable. Vaporwave not only lives, but thrives in this harsh environment, caught between life and death, the Vaporgatory. Artists use all sorts of tools to their advantage to create this dichotomous sound, but the most prevalent is most likely looping and repetition. They're used to create an array of emotions from anxiety to suspense to bliss. This could be used to lull you into a dreamlike state with repeating and flowing gorgeous tones, or shock and grip you with the feeling of cyclical entrapment, or any number of other emotions. Take 18 Karat Affair's 2011 song Daytona Speed, for example, which has a grand facade of an opening, followed by a looping and waning refrain. This song reminds me of walking home on a hot day, training and heavy, yet still hopeful for what's to come. A goal at the end of a long road that seems like it may never even get here. It evokes an image of sun-drenched Daytona, and just like the NASCAR racing this title is alluding to, this song is on a looping course that brings it right back to where it started. 18 Karat Affair looped 1.5 seconds of a 5-minute Spyro Gyra song from 40 years ago and transformed it into something entirely new. Just a tiny part of the original picture completely recontextualized. This image of a hot day in Daytona that 18 Karat Affair paints in our minds is nowhere near the vibe the original piece this was sampled from was, and it breaks my heart to see how many people say this is a genre of no talent and plagiary. So much passion and creativity is on display here. Some music traditionalists just can't appreciate this niche and amazing way of creating sonic experiences via sampled audio. Maybe they're just afraid of the display of reanimation. Music that has been dismembered and sewn back together. Sort of Franken-music. Vaporwave could make a person feel any number of feelings, from fear to relaxation to boredom, just like any other genre. This notion some people have that Vaporwave is nothing but bland music made even blander by slowing and cutting it is not only a bad take, but is quite literally false. Artists search for the perfect sample, rip it out of its context with the cold hands of the internet, and forge an entirely new contextual scene with it. Hell, most Vaporwave releases are concept songs and albums too, meaning it's not just a random collection of tracks, but a story being told with these obscure clips forced through a new dystopian lens. So the argument that Vaporwave is non-transformative is quite literally false. You might have heard the phrase "Vaporwave is dead" before, but I can assure you it's never been more alive. bubbling and thriving higher and louder than it ever has before, right under the malaise of modern pop music the last decade has had to offer us. This is a movement, a wave, and it shows no signs of slowing, actually quite the opposite. A large part of the reason Vaporwave is so hard to explain is because not even the producers of it truly know what it is. It's not in its infancy by any means, but with each new popular release, the whole soundscape adapts just a bit. The Vapor sound is constantly redefining itself. It's in an interesting position as a genre, to say the least. It's constantly being looked down upon, vying for its own legitimacy and to be taken seriously. But also, like, is it? There are some people who think Vaporwave is intrinsically political. But on the other side of that coin, there are all sorts of Vaporwave creators who don't think that there are any deeper themes. As we'll find out, both are important. But the future they both crave, where Vaporwave is just as respected as any other genre, is difficult to maintain. One of the reasons for this is that a ton of people in the Vaporwave scene not only listen to the music, but create it, since the skill ceiling for making a song could potentially just be slowing down an 80s song. This honestly leads to a lot of bad music, or at least mid music as expected, but an insane amount of obscure gems too. Vapor culture by design feeds off the obscure, so this is entirely fitting. But before we go too far, let's get back to Anemoia. Those feelings of Anemoia that Vektroid was able to make me feel haven't just sat festering inside of me. Through this strange and otherworldly medium that is the internet, I've been able to let my love for this genre blossom fully, and realize what Vaporwave truly is at its core. And that is a purgatory. A soundscape devoid of time and space, caught between life and death, criticizing our decisions of the past, choices of the future, and even itself. The penultimate postmodern experience. Vaporwave began its roots as near nothing but slowed down 80s music, and while that still holds true, it's discrediting to the thousands of original, sampleless Vaporwave artists out there, along with a plethora of subgenres that it's branched out into. Today we'll be having a listen to both and everything in between. If you have a base level or perhaps no understanding of what Vaporwave is, that's totally okay. Complicated themes and challenging topics to put into words is kind of at the heart of this whole thing. Vaporwave has a long journey behind it and an even longer odyssey ahead. It's a tale not unlike many other music genres, one trying to find beauty in emptiness, endurance, escape, and most importantly, feeling. Vaporwave has connected with many people on an extremely deep level and is a pitched down and chopped voice of the people in an increasingly corporate world. But to talk about that, we need to start many years ago, in an era lost to time, but is anything but gone. Perhaps no era of American history is more nostalgically driven than the 1980s. On every corner of the internet, you find people passionately longing for their time spent back then, sharing the sentiment that it was a simpler time. In a newer era, a similar feeling arrives. Young people who think that they were born in the wrong generation and wish to have been alive back then. But despite this adoration for the 80s many people hold today, those who live just a few more decades in the future looking back at this may not understand why people feel so strongly about it. Once the rose-tinted glasses we've been peering through inevitably slip off. For instance, due to the disinflationary monetary policy adopted by the Federal Reserve at the time and a massive energy crisis in 1979, America's first booming steps into the 80s was a slip and a fall into a deep economic recession. Unemployment was high, the tallest it stood since World War II. The national unemployment rate peaked at nearly 11%. Divorce rates started skyrocketing. Prices started rising. A house that cost you around $70,000 in 1980 would soon cost around $120,000 just 9 years later at the turn of the decade. In that same time frame, the price of a new car went from around $7,000 to $15,000, over double. Americans were thrust into a cycle of corporate monotony.
Coming to bed, honey?
Yes, dear.
Craving an escape from the capitalistic lifestyle America was getting accustomed to. The strange thing is, the big corporations were not only the problem, but the solution. Enter cable television. People wanted more than ever to be entertained and to escape into the new and exciting fictional and digital worlds that were popping up all around them. The entertainment industry took its largest strides in human history up to that point, paving the way for the entertainment megaprizes of the future. All forms of media boomed not only in popularity, but in potential. People were excited for the future, to say the least. 80s music is fondly remembered as one of the most beautiful and genuine eras of sound by many. A golden age of cinema erupted as many more people than ever were heading out to spend money at the movie theater. Arcades and video games as a whole began to show signs of their inevitable media dominance. Shows began to grip the American public more and more. And perhaps one detail more important than any other, the birth of children's programming. With this surge of popularity as children were spending more and more time in front of their televisions, an entirely new demographic was able to be marketed to for the first time. This spiraled into a famously unheard of amount of licensed toys. You could not go anywhere without seeing Optimus Prime, He-Man, the Thundercats, G.I. Joe. This may seem totally unimportant to what we're here to talk about today, but because of this boom in children's media, the entire corporate landscape was about to shift. Companies no longer cared about making an engaging and watchable experience for families, but instead shifted their primary objective to making as much profit as possible. Parents began questioning these shows for children, saying that they had basically just become 22-minute commercials. The break from work that was originally promised, television, had become the corporations themselves, dangling toys in front of an impressionable audience that they could make beg their parents for the newest toy. In every sense of the phrase, the United States was spending big. And not just the government. Americans were about to go on the biggest shopping spree the world had ever seen. It wasn't just the media businesses that were exploding in the 80s, though. Another quickly rising venture to make money was the fast food industry. The whole game changed when Ray Kroc, the founder of McDonald's, had an idea. He made it his goal that any person in the country could go to a McDonald's restaurant and order an identical burger. This mindset inspired many other companies, too, and turned America into the land of mass production and franchising chains. Oh man, this is the hardest sentence I've ever read. Okay. In the book Non-Places, Introduction to Anthropology of Supermodernity by French anthropologist Marc Aujou, he discusses something that had never had a name before. Non-places. Buildings that disregard their surroundings and form their own unnatural identity. For instance, a McDonald's isn't built to fit exactly in the perfect ecological spot and source local ingredients from surrounding areas and what is abundant to their locale as well as keeping its cultural identity. It's just built to look like every other McDonald's. The design isn't meant for any purpose other than making money by feeding people. So that means bulldozing land to pave a concrete slab on the earth to slap a McDonald's on every corner one would fit. I'm using McDonald's as an example here, but this was obviously the methodology of every company that could afford it. Locations like hospitals, hotels, and superstores, these places were built for the sole purpose of housing and servicing people. That's why when one of them is totally empty, it's unnerving. When the people are absent from these familiar locations, you see them as what they truly are for the very first time. Non-places. This ideology is basically like, okay, this is Sweden. This is Italy. This is Tokyo. This? I don't know where this is. This could be anywhere. It's no place. This may seem harmless enough at first, but Aujou posits that this could have some extremely negative effects in the long run about the way people think about places. A Walmart or 7-Eleven in California is going to look extremely similar to one in Indiana. This could dissolve a feeling of place if taken to its absolute extreme, and is just one of the first major things that has made life feel much less personal than it used to. Suddenly, everywhere you go, things start to blur together and feel the same. Right now, you might be saying that this is just how things are and have always been, and there wasn't any malicious intent behind these dehumanizing and largely impartial practices. You could say that it's quite the opposite, actually. Feeding people all across the country, providing people with goods and services, these are positive things. But from the way America and capitalism has handled all of this in the past few decades specifically, it's clear that every action these companies do is strictly for profit. A feeling of place was not on any of these CEOs' minds when speckling our world with buildings. But philosophers wonder if these early practices will snowball into something much scarier in the future. A world where there's no feeling of place because of these megacorporations generalizing to the nth degree. All of this might sound like a contemporary waste of time to talk about, but I'm really trying to set the scene here for Vaporwave's inevitable birth. Some people began to feel like they weren't special, and that this corporatized way of living was bad for how people think and treat themselves. All of this commodification and eruption of similar architecture made people feel more like NPCs and left some people feeling empty and unsatisfied. And while this sentiment back in the 80s was not a very popular one, over time more and more people have began to feel this way because of these very practices people warned about. Another old marketing tactic used by corporations at the time was that of muzak. We all know what muzak is. The slightly off-putting and flavorless music that would play in stores, offices, elevators, and hotel lobbies back in the day. This music was meant to calm people down and keep them in stores longer. Elevator music may seem harmless enough, but it was yet another thinly veiled attempt to capitalize even more. To keep these people numb and working and buying no matter how poor and sick and hungry and tired. In 1989, Ted Nugent said that muzak is an evil force in today's society, causing people to lapse into uncontrollable fits of blandness. He claimed it was everything that was wrong with music, and could be the downfall of it altogether. He attempted to buy and shut down the muzak company for $10 million, a bid that was ultimately refused. The 1980s is still remembered as being great at the time, and is still looked back upon as a magical time for many who experienced it because of this new and wonderful saturation of the entertainment market. But years later, it's hard not to feel that this was all just a plasticky shell, trying desperately to mask that our country was losing more and more money. These cracks the American people started seeing in the world around them only deepened into the 90s, which spawned a culture more dark and nihilistic than ever before. But the thing that would truly shatter the mirage came barely after the turn of the century. The September 11th terrorist attack shook up our world and left many things in its wake. One thing among many destroyed by 9/11 was the picturesque image of America that we'd been holding on so tightly to. You see, ever since America's infancy, we've been all about the idea of manifest destiny. We believed we were destined to spread across this country from sea to shining sea. So we did it, and left a horrible trail of terrorism in our wake. But the people of the time could overlook what was happening because, hey, it got us where we needed to go. America accomplished its goal of covering the country, and later, around the 1950s, we started to paint this utopian picture of what the country was supposed to be. People were so preoccupied in the 50s with their values that it's almost creepy. This perfect image of what life could be like is good and all, but that's not the average American. This idea of manifest destiny from America's infancy is showing itself again. We would create this plasticky new society because our desire to chase this perfect nuclear family lifestyle was so strong. Marketing used this as a strategy to make more sales, as they do with literally everything else. Our national pride and optimism had been commodified and sold right back to us. Then, just a couple years later, another interesting footnote in American culture: the cowboy cinema. The original cowboys were the Spanish vaqueros of the 1500s who lived in what is now Mexico. Basically, the people around Texas and New Mexico and Arizona saw what they were doing and started to do it too. But the American cowboys were just farmhands tending to cattle. The vaqueros at the time did this too, but they had a specific cowboy swagger to them and a lawless badassery that the Americans wanted so bad to replicate. We took their image, their idea, and made it into the most American thing of all time. Commodified it. Gunslinging cowboys like this did not exist, at least not here. But America romanticized this Wild West era to sell Clint Eastwood movies. As the corporate world really began to take over, right off the heels of this era of cowboy cinema, politicians and officials of the time would double down on these ideas of the past.
Some of you may be aware of my fondness for Western art. In the last couple of years, we've tried to bring its influence to the White House, a natural home for a very American expression.
Commodification, non-places, and business by propaganda were all things that plagued the 80s. Maybe that's why the 1980s feel so unapologetically American. And as I stated earlier, all of this changed at the turn of the century, a time when people were finally starting to show a little optimism for the grand future ahead. The 2000s. 9/11 shocked people with reality. This fake 50s utopian world we were trying to paint ourselves had finally torn. The 1980s started questioning society. The 1990s started rebelling against it. And after this moment, things would never be the same.
What's this other jet doing? What's this other jet doing? Holy fuck!
All of a sudden, there's two distinctly different eras, pre-9/11 and post-9/11. Our worlds were too different to be reconciled. Spirits were at an all-time low, and with all of this, along with the rise of the controversial new internet, people were desperate to go back to a simpler time. Enter Retromania. Retromania is the overwhelming addiction that pop culture has to its own past, and more specifically in this case, to one decade in specific. Now, of course, people have always been nostalgic. Perhaps hundreds of years ago, people pined for their childhood days as it was easier and more carefree. But between the 1980s and the 2000s, the world truly did get more complicated. There's no denying a claim that the 80s really is a simpler era in many ways. But Retromania honestly isn't something I blame the people for. Quite the contrary. The truth is, Retromania is a symptom of capitalism. It almost seems that with the circumstances that happened, it was almost inevitable that this insane 80s fever took place. And I say that like it's over, but it's truly not. It's waning, barely, but the Retromania is still in full swing. 80s blockbusters get rebooted and prequeled the fuck all. 80s classics get sampled into the ground and turned into annoying sound bites. This appreciation for a time not so long ago has turned into a worship, a romanticism of a very harsh and very real time. Toying with pop culture like this sort of erases time and space in a way. So many people are praying to be magically transported back to a time when a lot of really not so great shit was going on. After September 11th, people just wanted an escape from the scary world we lived in and the cyclical torture of everyday life. We receded back into our pasts for safety, as nostalgia was the one thing we knew was safe. Unluckily for us, they were happy to commodify that, too. Why do young people feel so meaningless and empty today, more than ever before in our past? Why has culture shifted towards nihilism? In my opinion, these questions are unanswerable without bringing up The internet has become an intrinsic part of human culture. We are nearly inseparable from it, and one day, most likely soon, we will be. It's a subject that can seem to get ignored in today's fast-paced world. For young people especially, it's hard to imagine a world without the internet because it's become so tidally locked with the way that we work. The internet has become a part of us, always with us, connecting us all. But it wasn't always this way. The internet began as a simple textscape. But back in the 90s, the world could never ever imagine what it would do to our way of living. And of all the people the internet touched, perhaps none were as affected as those who grew right along with it. People who were born at a time during the internet's infancy and saw it mature from a lawless and empty-feeling digital nightmare into an over-governed, empty-feeling digital nightmare. But before I sound too overly cynical, the internet has done amazing, near otherworldly things for the human race as a species. It's unlocked new things we could have never dreamed of just a few decades ago. It has evolved into something ineffable, something unrivaled in scale. But in an era of such limitless knowledge, drifting in an astronomical sea of information with no beginning and no end, individuals become desensitized. Everything becomes boring after a while, blurring together into a constant feed of the same thing you've already seen before. While the internet is a beautiful frontier of opportunity and progress, it's also extremely imposing, not entirely truthful, and teaches people strange and unusual social habits. Growing up on the internet, knowing that everything you say is broadcast to every person you know, it's no wonder why there's more depression and anxiety in people than ever before. As time marches on, people are only spending more and more time per day on the internet. Of course this affected the youth, the people who spend most of their time in a place where time is meaningless and all history exists simultaneously. The ease of access of the internet means you can start watching a movie from 1988, decide you instead want to listen to an album from 2022, and then scrap both ideas and watch a live performance of a comedian from 2004. I wouldn't have it any other way. But having everything at your fingertips can be overwhelming. It can make it harder and harder to find things that you feel are truly special. But as a user of the World Wide Web yourself, you've probably become good and well aware over your lifetime that the internet has a special connection to the alternative, the unusual, the strange, the bizarre. The things that stick out and stick around on the internet are the things that make us turn our heads, things we've never seen that make us question what we thought we knew before, things that make us ask questions like, what is art? But we'll address that later. The point I'm trying to make is that in an era of overstimulation and boredom, the niche is an oasis. And this is especially when it comes to music. When looking at pop music, some people can't help but feel a little sickened to their core with the way music went. And no, I don't just mean boomers who think any music past the top 20s hits aren't real. I mean people being discontent with the music industry at large and the mass-produced, assembly line Chinese knockoff quality beats with repetitive vocals only in place to become an earworm and sell records for a mega corporation. Dystopia type beat! Once it started sinking into the music industry just how much this process could rake in, the entire game changed. But with more and more musicians taking their careers into their own hands nowadays via the internet, this issue isn't as prevalent today. But this shitty pop music persisted for a long time. But through this corporate malaise that was music in the 2000s and early 2010s, something hidden under the surface was not only somehow existing, but thriving. While I was clear about how 80s music was one of the most popular avenues vapor artists love to sample, one that they love even more is none other than Muzak. The disgustingly bland corporate garbage that we know so well has gone full circle and has been twisted into something shockingly new and beautiful. Decades ago, music used to belong to the people. It was something that brought us together, and one of the only things to never culturally fade. But over the years, it had been commodified and corporatized into something unnatural. But the liberating new internet allowed people to twist Muzak back into the face of the corporations that did this, restoring music to the hands of the people once more. Vaporwave is subversive. It's the perversion of the capitalist wasteland. You expect to get this lifeless corporate sound and instead get a flurry of personality and individuality, the thing that the 1980s tried to take away from us. But hey, if Muzak and all this capitalistic jargon isn't for you, Vaporwave as a genre is no longer just a handful of artists remixing ancient media, as it's blossomed into dozens of unique subgenres with artists who create stunning original music with no sampling at all, and all for different reasons. Some artists have a complex view of what their art represents, and some leave it up for interpretation, making the music solely on vibes. There are subgenres like future funk, mallsoft, echo jams, vapor noise, hypnagogic pop, plunderphonic, synthwave, retrowave, outrun, sea-punk, vapor trap, and literally so many more. The vaporscape has grown and mutilated over the years. It has an oddly parasitic or infectious sound that has evolved so much from where it originally came. While vaporwave might be dead, it's effectively immortal at this point. Even if it does become uncool, in 30 years people will look back on vaporwave like they do about 80s music. The manufactured nostalgia will have become actualized nostalgia. And hell, there's so much more vaporwave being made than there ever was 80s music, so its inevitable comeback and reign may even last longer than its predecessors since there's way more to sift through. I mean, think about how cool that sounds, an infinite self-refilling bank of samples. I'm getting far too ahead of myself here though. Let's think more in the present, or more appropriately, in the past. Where exactly did this movement come from? As does every other genre, vaporwave has plenty of pioneers, but vaporwave's origins have a specific air of mystery and anonymity to them, and as we'll see soon, this is of course entirely intentional. Vaporwave's true beginnings began with meme culture. I'm sure the first time you heard it, it was in some obscure clip online, most likely Floral Shop, of course. I mean, most of the greats probably know the genre from that Vektroid song, like George Clanton was. And I think this mimetic origin sort of set vaporwave up for failure right out of the gate. Because of its status as a meme, people were expecting it to last weeks, maybe months, as most memes do. And when it persisted for years, people got somewhat confused.
This guy moaned at least this loud.
Their shallow view of the genre led to a lot of hate, which eventually boiled over into the infamous "Vaporwave is dead" memes, which then got turned into "Vaporwave is dead, long live Vaporwave" by the community. Now, is that not the most vapor thing you've ever heard? Perfectly dichotomous. This meme exposure might seem great at first, but it's actually not all it's cracked up to be. This sort of thing can be really grating, your art not being taken seriously, your life's passion being called nothing but a meme. But I think as time gone on and the memetics have become more integral part of our lexicon, that isn't really such a bad thing. But just back a few years ago, many artists almost quit, and some even did because of this meme perception of the genre. Others wanted to escape this mindset and took on new pseudonyms to restart anew. Many vaporwave artists in general use pseudonyms, but all for different reasons, be it to explore a new subgenre unpressured by the past work, or just to create a sense of the unknown. For instance, that Macintosh Plus song we talked about at the beginning of the video, the person behind that alias is Ramona Xavier, who primarily goes by Vektroid. Macintosh Plus is just one of dozens of pseudonyms that Xavier has used in her career. So many artists could be talked about when trying to talk about pioneers, mainstays, and game changers in the vapor scene over the years. Vektroid, 18 Karat Affair, Luxury Elite, Saint Pepsi, Infinity Frequencies, George Clanton, Truise, Chuck Person, Dan Mason, Nmesh, Blank Banshee, Vaperror, Golden Living Room, Haircuts for Men, many, many, many more. But all of those names I just listed off are effectively meaningless. Now that sounds mean as hell, but I do think that these artists might agree with me. That's why so many of them use pseudonyms. You can credit them all you want with the founding of Vaporwave, but anonymity and the notion of zero authorship is incredibly important to the ideals of Vaporwave at its core. It's somewhat vital to the vibe that Vaporwave artists are these faceless and nameless beings. These unknowns do nothing but increase the ever-present ghostly liminal space and corporatized feeling of ignorance. They conjure up a mysterious aura, as if these songs just appeared out of the blue, out of time, capitalizing on people's curiosity and desire to seek out and explore the unknown. Music as a market is so big that it's hard to gain traction, so Vaporwave took the complete opposite approach and is entirely indifferent to the marketing process in general, almost as if out of spite for the headache-inducing marketing people have dealt with for so long. And in doing this, they gain more traction than ever before, because us indie music hipsters want to listen to the unknown and the avant-garde. It's become increasingly difficult in recent years to pay musicians, especially when most people now want all the music in the world for free. But because of the scene's very clear stance when it comes to corporate authority, all Vaporwave tracks are copyright free. That right there is honestly the only reason why I was able to bring this video to your eyes and ears, because they have allowed me to. And ironically, in not being very strict about people using their music, they've marketed themselves incredibly well, since a brand new audience is listening to their stuff right now. You. While all of these talented people continue to enchant us with their tones today, Vaporwave truly kind of was an inevitability. In the world we live in, where nothing is free of music's criticism, of course one of the biggest things negatively affecting humanity has its own entire genre. But despite its melancholic beginnings as a call to action against late capitalism, it's grown into something unmistakably original, and to me is incredibly optimistic in the face of a dystopian crisis. Human beings will find the good in anything. We always adapt, always overcome. We are the people being oppressed by the higher-ups, and we twist their tactics against us into art. We thrive in the hardest conditions, just like Vaporwave. This music has been so important to me and my life. And now as a corporate wage slave adult myself, it's gotten me through more 8-hour shifts than I can even count. Any music that can keep me marching forward in a world I'm uncontent with gets an A+ from me. Vaporwave is a post-9/11, post-mortem, postmodernist masterpiece. It subverts what came before it, challenges both everything prior and even its own current state. It calls to light the failure of the future that we were promised in the past. It's skeptical of what consumer culture has done to not only people, but time and space itself. It speaks to those who are sick of media and drowning in an endless ocean of it. It's music for people who are sick of music. It's always said that Vaporwave is music nostalgic for a past that never happened, but that's wrong. In actuality, it's music nostalgic for a future that never happened. The American dream that the 80s tried to deliver us failed miserably. The 90s had an obsession with goofy future technology. Just think about what the 90s hacking looked like. 90s futurism was ridiculous. The dawn of technology was so exciting and so magical. and now it's cold and sterile. This so-called dead meme genre showed me so much. At first, it appealed to me because I really wanted to soak in that melancholic, beautiful 80s John Hughes-esque nostalgia. But as I've aged, I've realized that Vaporwave is a gorgeous blue and purple flower, blooming through a cracked slab of concrete. It shows us the future we could have gotten, and reminds us that instead of sulking in what could have been and what's lost time, we should keep it in the back of our minds, always be aware of what happened in the past, critical of what's happening in the present, and hopeful for the future. The Vaporgatory will persist in the virtual plaza, playing smooth gradient jazz until the end of time. Vaporwave is dead. Long live Vaporwave. This took me 2 years of ruminating, 6 months of work, and a decade of love to create. I don't care if this video does well at this point because I'm so proud of myself for completing it, but I do hope you enjoyed your time here. Please consider throwing a like or sub my way. I don't really like asking, but I know for a fact just mentioning it does truly help. The Mothmane is grateful. Hopefully my next video idea won't be as Herculean as this one was. I kind of felt like I had a gun to my head during the entire editing process. Who are you? Hey!